Hello and welcome back to another Fear the Walking Dead video, and today with Fear the Walking Dead finally over, let's look back at the final season and rank each episode from the final season from worst to best. So let's not dilly-dally and dive right into this with our worst episode of the season. Number 12 is episode 7. This is the big Strand return episode, and it is so boring. This episode is just so bad, and definitely one of the worst episodes of Fear we've got in a really long time. And what makes this episode worse is that it is very bad with reusing massive shots from previous seasons or previous episodes in the same season. They have big reveals in this episode, like major characters who died off screen. This episode is a really weak to the big comeback for the final 6 episodes. In number 11, we have episode 10, and this is only just a bit better than episode 7. This episode deals with the everyone go and find Alicia's body thing, and we have Tracy and Strand being annoying, and it's about everyone just kind of fighting each other, but not really fighting each other because they all kind of give up immediately, and there's a big fight off screen that's apparently really badass, but we don't get to see it. This episode really seems pointless by the end of it because we are right back at the start of our situation with Madison being like, well, I gotta go off and find Alicia because this episode was a bust. This episode basically was just about introducing Tracy to the show and having Strand be selfish, but they're treating him like he's the only good character in this situation. Moving up to number 10, and we have episode 9, and this is the big episode where Dwight and Sherry return to the sanctuary. The reason why this is so low is because of how bad the writing is and how many missed opportunities they have. This episode is really the setup for Dwight and Sherry for the end of the season, where they're like, let's go back to the sanctuary and rebuild it. However, it is just so dumb. The plot is that Dwight runs over to Virginia and he's just kind of had enough, but Sherry, June and Dove go up there to try and bring him back. Dove gets injured, and there's raiders who live in the sanctuary, and Dwight's like, we have to go to the sanctuary to go and save Dove. And that's about 20 miles away, and it's just so dumb because they could have just gone to Alexandria or something like that, which is just as far, if not maybe a little closer, and there'd be no guarantee the raiders would attack them. It's just a very poorly written episode, and it's just a very big disappointment. They could have done this episode so much better. There's just so many plot holes and just so many issues with this episode. In the number 9 spot is episode 11, the penultimate episode for Fear the Walking Dead. And this episode is a big Troy episode, which you could think is really good. However, the problem with this episode is that shoehorns in Crane, gives Troy a very rushed redemption arc, then completely just ruins that by suddenly killing off Troy for no reason. But we do get the only fight between people and people in this episode, but it's meh. This episode is about Ram and Troy and Madison together, and then wasting every single second. This episode has lots of issues, like it not making any sense how Troy's group now knows where Padre is, when the previous episodes were about Troy not knowing where Padre is, and him trying to find Padre. It just makes no sense. It feels like there's a missing episode between 10 and 11, and we get this. It is just a very disappointing episode, and they could have done so much better with a Troy and Madison episode. They could have had them maybe team up to try and save Tracy, but no, they're just running away from the worst villain ever made in the Walking Dead universe. At number 8, I have episode 5. This is the big Grace death ending and really sets up Morgan's exit in episode 6. The issue why this episode is so low is because how they did Grace's death. It was so poorly done, and this episode really stretches her death out. She takes so long to die, and then she suddenly turns. And Mo in this episode is so annoying, and the acting is just so bad. And this is Mo's big episode, basically, and she absolutely tanks it with how bad her acting is. And you can see that the actor for Grace is trying to carry the scene a little, but she's too busy trying to pretend to be dead. It is just a massive disappointment this episode, and I really dislike how all the characters are talking to each other over walkie-talkies. You have Morgan, who doesn't get to see Grace die, and he should have been there in Grace's final moments, but no, he says goodbye over a walkie-talkie, which is just so dumb and ruins the emotional impact that this episode felt like it was trying to go for. Moving on to number 7, and we have episode 1, and at this point episodes are no longer bad, they are meh to okay, and this is an okay episode. I really do like the Morgan and Madison dynamic, and they both do get equal screen time. The plot is simple and the setup for the Padre arc is good in this episode. The issues though, I do not like Mo. She's very annoying, but we do get to see the swamp for the first time, and it's very cool to see such a green swamp and everything like that, because Fear has always been about deserts and stuff like that, so it's very cool in this episode to see such a very unique environment that our characters are in. I just feel they could have done a bit better in this episode, and focusing on Mo is not a good start for your final season. In 6th place has to be episode 2, and this is another okay episode. This episode focuses on June, Dwight and Sherry, but I feel like at the start of this episode is the weakest point and really lets it down. It takes too long to get to the premise of the episode, and I feel like it's very convoluted to get June, Dwight and Sherry all together, but we get introduced to Dwight and Sherry's son, Finch. Where this episode really gets it going and really gets it exciting is this potential cure plot, and it gets a link back to Alicia, where June's like, Alicia didn't turn, maybe because of radiation. And that's why I feel this episode is strongest, is when it's unraveling this potential cure plot and what June's been doing within these 7 years, with her trying to find a cure and ending up having all these demons in her closet because she's killed all these people. It is very, very interesting and gripping. However, there are just a couple of small issues in this episode. One being that Padre teleports and they feel like they just kind of end up but at the end of the episode just to be there to have this insane ending. And the other one is it resets Dwight and Sherry's relationship again to being separated after they just got back together at the end of season 7. And that is really annoying because Fear does that every season, every couple of episodes. They're either broken up or back together. Moving on to number 5, we have episode 8. And this is where we're getting to the almost good episodes or just good episodes. And episode 8 is quite shocking. This is the big episode where we have the big reveal that Charlie is still alive. And originally I would put this a lot lower, but the way they deal with Charlie in this episode and have the Madison aspect also is done very well. When Madison finds out what Charlie has done, she acts how everyone should have acted back in season 4 with wanting to kill Charlie, and she sends Charlie off on a suicide mission, which ends up going badly, and that ends up breaking down what little rapport and relationship she has with Daniel. It never gets followed up in later episodes, but this episode is pretty entertaining, and I feel like this episode did redeem Charlie for me, and it was done very well. Charlie's brought back and quick exit was done well, and I was shocked by how well they did that. I was expecting Charlie to have some sort of big miracle thing and really annoy me, but no, they did Charlie well. Troy was very entertaining this episode, and the only issue I'd have is I felt like this episode needed to happen sooner with Fear. We shouldn't have waited 4 seasons for this redemption episode for Charlie. Moving up to 4th place, and we have episode 3. And this episode is really about demystifying Padre and showing us how far Madison actually went in those 7 years and how many lives she has ruined. This episode is very entertaining. The writing is not great, but there are lots of nice little moments and references to previous seasons. I really like how when Madison meets June, she calls her Naomi because she never knew her real name. There's a nice reunion between Madison and Daniel, and there's some cool action scenes here and there, but a lot of it sadly does happen off screen. The reveal of Padre is okay, but this episode does heavily retcon the timeline of Fear the Walking Dead, which does suck. Moving on to 3rd place, and we have episode 6, Morgan's final episode. And this episode is great. These next 3 episodes are the only great episodes of the final season of Fear, and episode 6 is a great goodbye to Morgan, and it gets rid of the terrible Padre arc. There's no big final battle. That's my one big issue. A lot of things happen off screen, and by the end of this episode, we have Finch die, Dwight and Sherry break up, and what really annoys me is that they completely drop the cure plot, and it's like, well, it didn't work on Finch, let's not try it ever again. That really did annoy me, but where this episode is strongest is with Morgan and Lenny James's performance as Morgan Jones. Him going in and out of sanity and slipping back into clear Morgan was absolutely amazing, and I really did like when Morgan goes mad, he blacks out, even though it's obviously there just to hide the budget. It worked in this episode, and it was very entertaining. And by the end of this episode, you have the callback to when Morgan left The Walking Dead to come to Fear. He then goes out, this is a message for Rick Grimes, calling back all the way to season 1 of The Walking Dead, which is great. This is just a perfect ending for Morgan Jones, and if we ever saw him again, that'd be great. But if it's the last time we saw Morgan, it's a great ending for Morgan and his daughter Mo. Now, the second best episode of the final season of Fear the Walking Dead for me is episode 12, the final episode. This episode has some issues. I feel like there's no major character deaths. It feels like characters are teleporting. A lot of action happens off screen. However, where this episode is strongest is with the callbacks, the little moments, and especially the endings. This episode ended Fear in such a great way, and it wasn't like The Walking Dead setting up this spin-off, this spin-off, this spin-off. No, it was about concluding the story of Fear, concluding these characters' story arcs, and I feel like every character got a great ending. Mostly I felt like June was half-baked, but outside of June's half-baked ending, everyone got a great ending, and especially we got a reunion between Madison and Alicia, and it's not just a cameo. She's in the good last 10-15 minutes of this episode. It is really, really nice. This episode is great because of how well it ended the show. It is not a great ending, but it's not a terrible ending. It's a good ending for this show. It doesn't deserve how well this ending was, but the episode itself had some great fights at Padre, and I liked how you had the original cast all in one place, so you could have the big scenes where you have Daniel, Strand and Madison all fighting with each other, and you get all those callbacks to season 1, 2 and 3, and you have all the new characters stuck at Padre fighting the army of the dead. I liked how they separated the cast between old and new. It is a very entertaining final episode for Fear the Walking Dead. Now here we are now at number 1, the best episode for the final season of Fear the Walking Dead for me is episode 4, King County, and this is the episode which finishes off Morgan's 13-year-long story arc. He's able to go back to where it all started. We get so many references to Rick Grimes and the first episode of The Walking Dead, and we give Dwight and Sherry having these kind of pseudo-villains. It is a very entertaining episode, and this episode does not feel like it deserves to be in Fear the Walking Dead. It feels like a Walking Dead episode. Every other episode I just talked about is a Fear episode. They definitely do feel like Fear episodes, but this episode was on a whole new level in quality, writing, acting. This episode was leagues above the rest in my opinion, and it was done so well. And just to tie off Morgan's whole 13-year character arc and have Morgan be able to move past this thing that's been holding him down, Dwayne and his wife, and be able to finally put them to rest after all this time was just so perfectly done. I absolutely love this episode, and this is probably the only episode I will re-watch in the final season of Fear. And that is my list on each episode from the final season, ranked worst to best. So please tell me down below, do you agree with my list or do you disagree? And if you disagree and have a different list, I'll see your lists down in the comments. But that's it for me today, so goodbye, peace out, and I'll see you in the next one.